Emily Carter's sharp voice cut through the warm afternoon air like shattered glass. You are just a lowly maid. Every table on the veranda fell into silence. Utensils held frozen in midair, and conversations faded away. All eyes shifted to the center aisle of the garden restaurant where Grace Johnson stood motionless beside a long banquet table. A tall crystal vase filled with ivory roses had moved slightly just by an inch. It had not tipped over or spilled, but even that was enough to make her feel exposed. Emily stood proudly in her tailored satin wedding gown, the sunlight catching the shimmer of the pearl-embellished bodice. Look at what you've done, she snapped, directing her finger at the floral arrangement. Is it really so difficult to do one thing correctly? This is a wedding, not a church potluck. Grace stayed still, her breathing slowing as the harsh words sunk in. She had been in this job long enough to recognize condescension disguised as politeness. But today there was no pretense. I'm sorry, Grace replied calmly. It just shifted a little. I will fix it right away. Then Helen Carter stepped forward, her lips pressed tight as if tasting something bitter. This isn't how we do things here. You people should know better than to touch what you cannot afford. Grace's hands froze midair at the insult. You people, Helen repeated, meeting her gaze steadily without blinking. Help staff call yourselves whatever you want. Her eyes flickered to Grace's skin. This is why we asked the agency to be more selective. Appearance matters. The whispered conversations among the guests gradually fell silent, spreading a stillness that seemed to envelop the entire garden. Grace felt the full intensity of countless eyes upon her, the sharp sting of being belittled not for her actions but simply for her identity. Emily folded her arms, her voice dripping with malice. Don't pretend you do not understand what this means. You are just a background figure that is your place. So, if you want to keep your modest paycheck, perhaps you should drop to your knees and apologize in front of everyone. Grace stood upright, her grip on the vase steady. I have already said sorry. I will fix the centerpiece, but I will not kneel. Emily's face flushed deeply. You people always play the victim card, always acting as if you belong in our world. A collective gasp rippled through the lawn, followed by the faint clinking of glass in the distance. Then came a new voice, low and controlled, yet charged with restrained anger. What exactly did you say? David Mitchell, the groom, emerged from behind the floral archway, tall and commanding in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze held Emily firmly. Emily blinked. Darling, he insulted me. David stood firm. And you insulted my father. Emily froze at that. My father? He pressed on. He is a black man, the man who raised me, the very man you invited to sit in the front row today. When you speak down to Grace like that, you are not just disrespecting her, you are disrespecting him. And you are disrespecting me. The weight of David's unwavering presence was felt deeply, as was Grace's silence. Rejection spoke louder than any yell. So do not let this instant slip away. If you believe that dignity holds more value, then diamonds write in the comments where you are watching from. Because someone close might need to hear this story as well. Helen Carter interrupted David Mitchell quietly but firmly. He stopped her with a glance. This is a public event. You both made it public, he said, turning toward the crowd. I refuse to marry into a family that regards people like Grace Johnson as inferior. I will not stand beside someone who thinks skin color defines a person's value. Emily Carter stepped forward, her voice trembling. You are exaggerating. No, I am seeing the truth clearly for the first time. He said calmly, pulling the ring from his finger, looking at it for a moment before placing it into Emily's shaking hand. This wedding is canceled. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as chairs scraped loudly against the floor, like crashing waves. Many guests rose, some walked away while others shook their heads in disbelief. Emily glanced around desperately but found no one to support her. Helen parted her lips but said nothing. Grace stayed motionless, her hands no longer shaking. She had spoken no harsh words. She had told no falsehood. She had merely refused to kneel, and somehow that was enough to change a wedding into a moment of awakening. Grace did not recall how her feet moved. She only sensed they carried her slowly and steadily away from the table and from the ruins of what should have been the flawless wedding. Sunlight poured gently through the windows, illuminating her departure. The sunlight filtered through the oak leaves, casting a warm golden pattern on the grass, yet all she sensed was the heavy gaze of every pair of eyes fixed on her. She did not shed a tear, nor did she lower her eyes. Her apron remained firmly tied at her waist, and her name tag sat slightly askew. Her hands still carried the faint aroma of roses and lemon polish. Behind her, murmurs rose into an uneasy hum. "Did that really just happen?" someone whispered. "He walked away because of her?" The voice held no anger, merely astonishment. Grace recognized that tone well. It was the uneasy feeling people get when they realize they have seen something unforgettable. She moved toward the back of the garden where the staff station was nestled behind a wall draped with ivy. A handful of coworkers gathered there by the ice bins and serving trays, faces stunned, mouths slightly open and eyes wide. It was Carmen, the pastry assistant, barely 20, still blinking as if in disbelief. "Did he really cancel the wedding because of what Emily said to you?" Grace released a slow breath. "He canceled it because of what he believes. I just happened to be the one who gave him a reason to speak out." Carmen shook her head in amazement. "That is insane. It was incredible, but you know they are going to blame you." Grace's voice was low yet steady. "I understand, and I know they might take your job too." For a long moment, silence fell, broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant clinking of glasses from the guests who had already returned. As they waited, the ceremony yet to commence, a voice behind them disturbed the silence. Miss Williams, Grace Johnson, turned around. It was Mr. Langston, the general manager of the veranda, a gentleman with salt and pepper hair, always impeccably dressed, and maintaining a voice perfectly balanced, never warm, never harsh, only firm. "I need to speak with you in my office," he said. The atmosphere seemed to change. Carmen touched Grace's arm softly. Grace nodded once and followed him. The office was small, lined with white cabinets and old-fashioned posters outlining employee standards. Mr. Langston did not sit down. Instead, he closed the door, folded his arms, and stared at her for a long time before speaking. "To be frank with you, Grace, this is a disaster." "I understand. Do you really?" he queried, not unkindly. "This was the most high-profile wedding we have ever accommodated. The Carters were about to sign an ongoing private events agreement. After today, that is gone," she replied. "I did not raise my voice," Grace insisted. "I did not create a scene or touch anyone." "You did not kneel, no," he said softly. "I did not," she affirmed quietly. Mr. Langston looked at her with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "You are a diligent worker, never late, and clients have always appreciated you. But now I have two angry women outside telling every guest that this wedding was intentionally ruined by staff. I am already receiving calls from the media." Grace kept her shoulders square. "So am I fired?" she asked. There was a lengthy pause. "Technically, no," he answered, "but I am going to place you on paid leave for the time being. Until this situation fades away, she had anticipated a worse outcome. May I gather my belongings?" Mr. Langston hesitated before moving aside. She left the office, her heart strangely composed. There was no longer any point in arguing. Her bag rested in the break room under a cubby marked GJ. She grabbed it and swung it over her shoulder as the door behind her opened. It was Marcus, the young barback, with dreadlocks and sneakers that always squeaked on the floor. I witnessed everything he said, his eyes intense. That was not just impolite, that was hateful. Grace said nothing. "I've been waiting for someone to speak up, but I did not expect it to be you." His voice trembled with admiration. "They told us to remain silent, always. Quiet." "I was not trying to cause a scene," she replied. "No, you did not. You took a stand." She looked at him. This boy barely old enough to drink, who spent weekends cleaning, spilled champagne for wealthy strangers, while learning to smile through being invisible. He did not seem invisible now. He appeared alive. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. Grace blinked. "Thank you, Marcus." She stepped into the parking lot and had almost reached her old Corolla when she heard footsteps behind her. "Grace, it was David." She turned surprised. He no longer wore the tuxedo jacket, only a white dress shirt, with sleeves rolled to his elbows, collar loose, no tie. His face still bore the burden of recent events, but there was a new steadiness in his stride, like a man. The person who had finally stopped pretending spoke. "I'm sorry to interrupt," as he approached slowly. "I just needed to say something." "You do not owe me anything, Mr. Mitchell." "I believe I do," he answered. "You stood up when you did not have to, and I noticed it. To be honest, if you had not, I might have gone through with it. I might have ignored the voice inside me warning something was wrong." Grace frowned slightly. "You would have found out eventually." "Yes," he replied, "but possibly not soon enough." She was at a loss for words. He appeared tired, yet not defeated. "Listen," he continued, shifting his stance, "I am not just a CEO. I help manage a hospitality group. We are launching a new concept in Austin, a small-scale, community-centered, locally staffed venue. I am assembling a leadership team. I want individuals who perceive the world as it truly is, who do not hesitate when it counts. Would you consider joining us?" Grace looked at him, visualizing herself managing front-of-house operations and fostering the culture. "We are building this place from the ground up, Grace. I want it to be a place where no one is ever asked to sacrifice their dignity." She swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the day's emotions. "You are offering me a job. I am offering you the opportunity to create something better." A breeze lifted a lock of her hair across her face, which she brushed away. "I will think about it," he smiled. "That is fair." As he began to walk away, she called out, "David!" He turned around and she said, "Thank you for noticing." He said, "I was raised to know better. My father made certain of that, and then he disappeared." Grace stood beside her car for quite some time, watching the breeze flow through the trees, lifting petals from the archway that would never witness a walk beneath it. The wedding was canceled, her job lost, yet for the first time in ages, she experienced a feeling she had not known since childhood in her grandmother's kitchen, humming hymns and kneading dough. She finally felt recognized, a sensation far stronger than any apology. The following morning, Grace woke to the buzzing of her phone on the nightstand. Her eyelids were heavy, her body aching from the previous day's long shift and even longer emotional strain. For a moment, the scenes of the garden, the shouting, the stares escaped her memory until the harsh words returned like a slap. "You are merely a lowly maid." Slowly sitting up, she reached for the phone to find 53 missed alerts. The first message was from Carmen saying, "Girl, you're everywhere. Check the news." The second was from Marcus noting, "They are discussing you on the local channel and not negatively." She rubbed her eyes, rose from bed, and padded barefoot to the kitchen. Sunlight poured through the small apartment windows, reflecting off the white tiles like a gentle reassurance. She turned on the television just in time to hear the news anchor declare, "The wedding between Emily Carter and David Mitchell, chief of the Kingsley Foundation's culinary division, has been officially canceled." Witnesses reported that the groom ended the event in public after the bride and her mother verbally insulted one of the catering staff, Grace Johnson. Many are calling it an obvious act of racial discrimination. Her breath caught, the screen switched to a shaky cell phone video where someone had recorded the entire incident. There, she stood beside the table, her hands steady, her voice composed. Then, Emily Carter appeared, shouting, just as David Mitchell intervened. The ring fell into Emily's hand. It felt like a scene from a movie, but it was her reality, her name, her skin. A headline scrolled across the bottom. The tag was just a simple trend as the wedding incident video went viral. She reached for the remote, but before turning off the television, her phone buzzed again from an unknown number. She let it ring multiple times. Voicemails followed, some from journalists seeking a statement, others from strangers expressing gratitude for her courage. A woman's voice broke through tears. "My daughter works in hospitality. She has faced what you experienced. Thank you for standing up." "Thank you, Grace." Maya switched off her phone and sat in silence, the sound of coffee brewing in the background. She remained still, part of her wanting to block out reality and pretend no one was watching. But another part, calm and stronger, understood this was not a moment to disappear. By midday, her name was featured on morning radio programs, podcast discussions, and social media channels. People shared their own experiences of feeling dismissed or belittled. The tag, just a simple label, had ignited a wider conversation. What once seemed insignificant had become a powerful symbol, a rallying cry that unleashed stories of injustice and resilience like a rising tide. Yet, not all the feedback was supportive. Browsing through some comment sections, Emily Carter noticed the harsh negativity too. She destroyed a wealthy girl's reputation just to seek attention, one comment read. She should have stuck to her duties, said another. Another outspoken black woman stirring trouble. The words cut deeply, not because they were unfamiliar, but because they came with such force. Still, none of it could silence what David Mitchell had told her. You didn't cause a scene, you took a stand. One afternoon, a gentle knock came at the door, almost hesitant. When Grace Johnson opened it, she found Helen Carter holding several brown paper bags and a small foil-wrapped tray. I brought lunch, Helen said with kindness. Grace smiled and stepped back. Come in. You're braver than I am to face all this chaos out there. Helen's expression remained composed. Do you think I am afraid of some noise on television? Honey, since 1973, I've been told to move to the back. You have only given people a fresh reason to push ahead. They sat together at the tiny kitchen table, sharing collard greens, fried catfish, and sweet tea. The meal tasted like home and memories. Helen wiped her mouth with her napkin before leaning closer. You should be aware they are starting to panic. Emily Carter's public relations team issued a statement this morning, calling everything a misunderstanding. She added with a smirk, You overreacted, huh? Grace's jaw clenched. I spoke only 2 words. I won't kneel, she said firmly. Helen nodded. They also lost 2 business partners. Sponsors and Emily Carter's father were pulling away from her. Rumors suggested that their family's reputation might not recover from this scandal, Grace Johnson thought quietly. She did not smile because she did not want to take pleasure in anyone else's downfall. Yet she sensed something more profound. The scales were tipping. Later that night, a message request appeared on her social media. The name caused her to freeze, Emily Carter. Hesitantly, she opened it. The message read, I apologize for what I said and how I said it. I was overwhelmed and did not mean it in that way. I hope someday you can forgive me. There was no voice note or video, only words typed from behind a screen. Grace did not reply that evening. Her phone rang again shortly afterward. This time, the caller ID showed a familiar number. It was David Mitchell. She answered after the second ring. Hello, he said, his tone calm and steady. Hi, I did not want to disturb you, he continued, but I thought you should know that I met with my team today. We have agreed to proceed with the new restaurant idea. We are calling it Uprise. We will employ full-time staff with fair wages, offer mental health support, educational grants, and ensure every leadership role is held by people of color. Grace blinked, genuinely impressed. I meant what I said, Mia. I want you to join my team, not as a token or because of recent events, but because you are exactly the kind of person I trust to lead with dignity under pressure. You are calm, collected, and aware of your value. She hesitated. I don't have a management degree and have never led a team. You've led by example, he replied, and that is something many with degrees fail to learn. She swallowed hard. A lump formed in her throat. Then she said, Yes, I accept. There was a lengthy pause on the other end, followed by a breath and the words, Welcome aboard. The call ended and Grace sat in silence once more. But this time the stillness was not heavy. It felt charged with possibility, the kind that hangs in the air just before dawn. In the days that came after, news about Uprise spread quickly. Some applauded the daring vision while others criticized it as impulsive and divisive. David, however, stood firm and so did Grace. She met with the design team, touring the half-completed restaurant space and the old jazz club coming back to life. She attended hiring meetings and talked to community leaders. People approached her not to seek pity, but to ask for direction. Each time someone addressed her as Miss Johnson or invited her to join discussions, she recalled that day in the garden, the vase, the cloth, that voice whispering low. She remembered choosing not to kneel, and that decision changed everything. By the end of the week, a new plaque was mounted at the restaurant's entrance. It read, Uprise, founded on dignity, led by grace built for all. Below this, in smaller bronze engraving, was a line inspired by Grace Johnson, who stood when silence felt easier. The soft click of Grace's heels echoed through the unfinished space of Uprise as she walked past exposed brick walls and window-taped blueprints. Outside, Austin sparkled under the late afternoon sun. Inside the rising restaurant, a quiet excitement throbbed, booths covered with sheets and piles of menus, ready to be unleashed. Waiting for approval, a whiteboard covered in real names hung on the back wall with the heading first-round hires. Grace looked over every name twice. Carmen, Marcus, Ruth, her chest swelling with something almost too large to contain. Only a week ago, she had left a position where she felt invisible. Now she stood at the forefront of an endeavor meant to make others truly visible. "Grace, do you have a minute?" David's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him stepping down from the contractor's office, sleeves rolled up once again, a phone in one hand and a manila folder in the other. "I wanted to review the floor plan updates with you. We're thinking about placing a community table right in the middle, something big and family style. What do you think?" She examined the space. That would be meaningful. Meals shared, stories exchanged. It felt right. He smiled and said, "Exactly. I want this place to be somewhere your grandmother could have walked into without a second thought." Grace smiled softly, knowing her grandmother would have checked the spice rack first. David laughed, then grew serious. "Listen, the media is still circling. They've requested interviews with you, CNN, a couple of podcasts. I've told them you want to choose your own timing." Grace's expression changed. "I'm not sure yet. I don't want to become just another headline. I want to create something lasting. That is the story." "I understand," he replied. "And just so you know, you're already telling it just by being here." As they walked through the restaurant side by side, workers acknowledged them with nods. Grace, with growing respect and a sense of closeness, was never just a symbol to them. She was their leader, the one making choices, someone who recalled their names, inquired about their well-being, and noticed when their hands trembled or their eyes showed fatigue. She did not command from above, but stood side by side with them. That evening, she stayed late. The team had already left. The music was silenced, and only the soft buzzing of the street lamps outside the large front windows filled the quiet room. Grace sat at one of the plain wooden booths, a notebook open before her. She was creating a manual for the staff, not one filled with strict orders, but rooted in principles. The first page carried only 3 sentences. "We do not bow to cruelty. We rise to dignity. We serve with pride, without shame." A sudden tap on the window surprised her. Looking up, she saw a familiar face, Ruth standing outside with a paper bag in one hand, and that unmistakable look that always meant you forgot to eat again. Grace opened the door. "Let me guess, collard greens and macaroni and cheese, too," Ruth said as she raised the bag. "Come on, you have to fuel that fire in your belly." They settled together beneath the gentle hanging lights in a corner booth. The food brought warmth to the space as much as the friendship. "They were still talking about you on the radio," Ruth said while unwrapping a piece of cornbread. "But you know what really struck me? It was not the drama, but how many people called in after people who had worked in kitchens, hospitals, and hotels. People who have put aside their ego for a paycheck. You didn't just ignite a fleeting moment, Grace. You opened something profound." "I didn't want to," Emily said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I simply did not want to face humiliation." "That is exactly the point," Helen responded. "You defended yourself, and in doing so, you gave others the courage to do the same." Grace slowly stirred her sweet tea, lost in thought. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if he had not heard, if David had not intervened." Helen's look was sharp yet gentle. "Then you would still be stuck because you did not rise on your own. He was merely a witness." Later, after Helen left, Grace returned to the whiteboard with the staff names. She picked up the dry erase marker and wrote above all the names, "Everyone belongs, no exceptions." The following morning brought more than just daylight. It brought a letter hand-delivered by a courier addressed directly to her. She opened it cautiously, anticipating media frenzy or worse, legal issues from the Carters. Instead, it was from David's adoptive father, Harold Mitchell. "Grace, you do not know me personally, but I observed what unfolded last week with deep respect and pride. My son was taught that dignity holds greater value than appearances, and when I saw how you stood firm and composed, I recognized my mother in you. I saw every woman who once cleaned tables no one noticed, but who carried herself with pride regardless. Thank you for reminding this country what grace under pressure truly means. If you are ever in Chicago, dinner is on me with all due respect. Harold Kingsley carefully folded the letter, sensing more than just the weight of the paper, but the significance behind it. Later that week, Uprise held its first private soft launch before the official opening, inviting community leaders, kitchen staff, bus drivers, school teachers, and elders from nearby churches. There was no press, no announcements, just a heartfelt meal prepared and shared with genuine care. Grace Johnson stood near the entrance, personally welcoming each attendee. When Marcus arrived, supported by his mother, Grace embraced him warmly. Seeing Carmen wearing heels that seemed uncomfortable, she smiled and whispered, "You really know how to dress up." As Ruth walked in, every member of the kitchen crew burst into applause. At the close of the evening, David Mitchell lifted a glass of sweet tea. "I want to propose a toast," he declared, with a voice full of strength, "to dignity that is not granted, but chosen, defended, and lived. And to the woman who reminds us all that standing tall is not about how you hold yourself, but about the purpose you carry." Emily Carter's cheeks flushed. She scanned the room, not noticing the decorations or lighting, but focusing on the people, the abundance on the table, the genuine laughter free of pretense, and the sense of belonging that did not depend on any badge or introduction. For the very first time in her life, she did not feel like someone merely serving the meal. She felt part of it. She had created her own place. The second week of Uprise's soft launch began with a crowd stretching out the door as word had started to spread throughout the area. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, yet not through flashy advertisements or billboards. It was passed quietly from barbershops to bus stops, shared along text message chains, and in church newsletters. The Uprise had become more than just a restaurant. It was a symbol showing that someone like them had created something special and that it welcomed everyone. There was no dress code for respect and no security guard guarding kindness. Grace stood by the entrance, clipboard in hand, moving seamlessly between guests and staff like the maestro of a gentle orchestra. She wore navy slacks and a rust-colored blouse that complemented the warm hues of the wooden-paneled walls. Her hair was braided and neatly coiled into a bun, practical yet graceful. Frequently, someone stopped to hug her, shake her hand, or quietly say, "Thank you." She always replied with the same calm and genuine sincerity. This was not about her, but about what they were building together. At exactly 12 minutes past 12 in the afternoon, Grace noticed a man slipping into the crowd. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, Caucasian, with an air that conveyed both refinement and curiosity. Dressed in a navy suit without a tie, he carried a leather notebook. He did not request a table, but slowly surveyed the room, seeming more interested in the atmosphere than the menu. Grace's gaze followed him as he selected a table for two near the back. He pulled out a chair and opened his notebook. No phone or laptop, just pen and paper. Old-fashioned, attentive, and intentional. David arrived a few moments later, looking up from his phone. "Did you notice him too?" Grace nodded. "He is not a local. The car had York plates when he emerged," David muttered. "And he's definitely not here for a meal." Grace did not show any reaction. "Let him observe," she said calmly. "Are you sure we are doing this for the proper reasons?" "We do not shy away from the truth," she added firmly. David exhaled deeply, massaging the back of his neck. "That is why you lead," she smiled softly and moved toward the kitchen. "Make sure Helen does not add too much salt to the greens. You know she gets a bit tense when she's nervous." A laugh burst from the stove area. "And girl, I have been cooking well before you even understood seasoning." "I am not anxious," Helen responded confidently. Laughter spread through the kitchen. At the table in the back, the man continued jotting down notes. Occasionally, he glanced up to watch Grace talk to a child about his allergy, or to crouch beside an elderly person to ask about the cornbread's flavor. He carefully noted staff names when they introduced themselves. He never pulled out a recorder or took pictures. He simply listened attentively. Hours later, just as Grace was about to take her brief rest, the man quietly approached her near the bar. "Miss Johnson?" She turned toward him. "That is me." He offered his hand. "Stephen Lang, I write for The Atlantic. I assumed you might be a writer." You listen more closely than most, he smiled warmly. That is kind of you. I would like to write about this place, about you, but I will not publish anything without your approval. She hesitated. What perspective are you pursuing? She asked. None, he replied. I am not here to chase controversy. I believe people have forgotten what true power really means. I believe you reminded them. She observed him a little longer before indicating a nearby booth where we can talk for 15 minutes, after which I have a delivery order to verify. They sat down, and Grace spoke candidly about the wedding, about the insult, about not kneeling, not out of arrogance, but out of self-respect. She mentioned David, but never glorified him. She spoke about her team, her grandmother, and the quiet defiance found in showing up fully every single day, even when nobody notices. Lang inquired, leaning forward, what moment made you realize things would not return to normal? She was silent for a moment, then said, it was after the wedding exploded. I was walking home still in my uniform when I passed a little girl, maybe 10, sitting on her stoop. She looked up and said, my mama said you did not bow down. I want to be like you when I grow up. That frightened me the most, because I understood I was no longer invisible. I could not be. Lang remained quiet for a long moment, then quietly nodded and said, that is your story the country must hear. She agreed, but on one condition. No exploitation, no revisiting trauma for clicks. If he wrote about her, he had to include all of them. Carmen, Ruth, Marcus, the staff, the guests, the community. Lang promised, and a week later, the article was published, The Maid Who Did Not Kneel and the Restaurant That Rose With Her. It was considerate, with no sensationalism or tabloid drama, just a sincere human story about pride, community, and resilience. A wave of support surged in the heart of Texas as the article spread far beyond anyone's expectations. Contributions poured in from the community. Local business figures reached out eager to collaborate, while chefs from New Orleans, Atlanta, and even Chicago requested training with Grace Johnson's team. Oprah's group called twice. Yet Grace never allowed the distractions to affect her focus. She arrived early each day, helped clean the floors, and kept her team steady. You're bound to become famous, David Mitchell joked one morning while cutting onions. I do not want to be famous, Grace replied, tossing him a fresh towel. I want to make a difference. However, fame often arrives without warning. Within a fortnight of the article's release, a call came from the James Beard Foundation. David answered and then rushed into Grace's office, phone blazing with urgency. Emily, they want to nominate you for the Leadership Award. Grace blinked in disbelief. You must be kidding. No, your name has come up 3 times already. They are sending the official documents today. She sat down slowly, still wearing her apron. I was just trying to stop someone from embarrassing me. Now I am teaching the nation what standing tall really means. David said, this is bigger than us all. That evening, Grace returned home and pulled out a letter from Harold Mitchell. She read the last sentence again. Thank you for reminding this nation what grace under pressure truly looks like. She pondered. Maybe it was never about the fire. Perhaps it was about the warmth. The kind of warmth that spreads, that nourishes. Outside. Through her window, the lights of Uprise shone brightly long after closing time. Not because someone forgot to switch them off, but because certain places, once illuminated, do not easily fade. Not when they are founded with intention, not when they are hard-earned. The afternoon sun cast elongated amber rays across the gleaming floors of Uprise as Grace Johnson sat quietly in her small office, tucked away behind the kitchen. A soft murmur of voices drifted from the dining area, only softened by the low hum of Ruth's gospel playlist playing gently in the background. Grace was going over the weekend timetable. David Mitchell had called to say he needed to take his daughter to a school recital, and Carmen requested time off to accompany her mother to the clinic. This was the kind of steady, unobtrusive leadership Emily Carter valued. No grand gestures, just the daily nature of trust, responsibility, and care. Then a gentle knock came at the doorframe. Grace looked up to find David standing there with an unreadable expression, immediately putting her on edge. There is someone outside asking for you, he said slowly. Press again? No. Personnel. She set the clipboard with the schedule aside. Are you going to give me a clue? David rubbed the back of his neck. Let's just say he is wearing a suit far too elegant for this weather. and his accent is not from around here." That was all Grace needed. She moved past him, her breathing already quickening. She had a strange, instinctive feeling that this visitor was no ordinary customer or admirer. It was a shadow looming unexpectedly. As she turned the corner into the dining room, she spotted him standing just inside the doorway, seeming uncertain about his presence there. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man dressed in a charcoal suit, his salt and pepper beard carefully groomed, carrying the air of someone accustomed to commanding spaces. Without a word, Grace froze, her heart pausing for a brief moment. "Mr. Mitchell," she whispered. He turned, and for a second, the stern expression on his face softened. "Miss Johnson," he replied. The atmosphere in the room shifted slightly as staff and guests noticed him. Grace gestured for him to follow and led him to the private lounge they occasionally used for extra guests or confidential discussions. Once inside, she closed the door behind them. "I never thought I would encounter you here, David Mitchell," said Grace, her voice steady. David, the billionaire businessman and former adoptive father of Grace's previous employer, did not immediately sit. Instead, he looked around slowly, appearing to assess what had arisen from the ruins of that disastrous wedding. Finally, he spoke. "I read the article, and then I read the follow-up. I believed I owed you a visit." Grace crossed her arms firmly. "You owe me nothing," she replied. "No," he insisted, meeting her eyes directly. "I owe you everything, and so does my son." Her breath hitched. "He still hasn't spoken to me," David admitted, lowering himself into one of the chairs with a heavy sigh. "But I do not blame him. I was blind to her mother, and how my silence allowed them to act the way they did." Grace settled slowly opposite him, her mind racing. His posture remained cautious as Mitchell lifted his gaze. "That day, I watched the footage of you standing there, shouting. I did not utter a single word. Seated among friends who treated it as a joke, I did nothing." Grace's silence weighed heavier than any critique. "But what you have accomplished since then," his voice softened a bit. "You did more than merely stand firm. You constructed something. You did not bring others down, Grace. You elevated everyone around you." She studied him intently. "What is your true purpose here?" He hesitated before answering. "Because I want to help discreetly. No public announcements, no staged greetings. I want to invest, to provide anything you require to move this forward." She remained still, unblinking. "Do you believe money can solve this?" "No," he confessed. "I believe money should follow the cause. There is a difference." She measured his words, the honesty in his tone, the fatigue in his eyes, yet also the privilege that clung to him like a familiar fragrance. "If you want to assist," she said at last, "then support the people I support. Not only the restaurant fund, but the scholarship initiative we are launching. Back the food truck venture in East Austin. Offer kids something they can truly call their own, not simply rent." He blinked and agreed slowly. "You already have a strategy." "I have had one since the moment that girl shouted at me," she answered. "I just stopped waiting for others to endorse it." He stood up. "I will arrange for my team to reach out," he said quietly. As he turned away, he paused and added one more thing. Grace raised an eyebrow. "I hope one day my son might find it in his heart to talk to me again. But until then, I am relieved he stepped away from that altar because you showed him a kind of strength his father never taught him." She did not answer, only allowed the words to settle into the quiet like ash drifting on water. After he left, Grace Johnson sat alone for several minutes, uncertain whether the fact that David Mitchell had come at all or the chance that his remorse was genuine disturbed her more. Later that night, Grace walked through the restaurant after closing time. The chairs were stacked, the floors spotless, and the aroma of sweet potato and rosemary still hung in the air. She found herself back at her office where a small envelope had been slipped beneath the door. She picked it up. No name, no logo, only her name written in elegant cursive. Inside was a check for 7 figures and a sticky note bearing 3 words for the future. No signature included. She stared at it for a long moment before opening her desk drawer and placing the check inside, not in her account, but in the folder marked Community Equity Fund Launch Phase. She closed the drawer firmly and whispered to herself, "Let us make them proud." Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Ruth hummed softly again while wiping the counters for the 3rd time that day. Marcus had just finished locking the back door. Carmen sat on a stool, scrolling through the list of preparations for tomorrow. They were ready for what was coming next because the effort never ceased, and Grace had just opened the door to something new, far greater than merely a restaurant. She had unlocked a movement grounded not in opposition but in renewal, founded not on revenge but on foresight, and it was just beginning. 7 days after the envelope arrived, Grace Johnson stood before a gathering of local entrepreneurs in a humble community center on East 12th Street. The folding chairs creaked beneath them. The air conditioning unit hummed with weary effort, yet the room vibrated with an electric sense of hope. Clearing her throat, her hands gripped the edges of the podium tighter than intended. "I am not here to discuss charity," she started. "I am here to discuss power." Some raised eyebrows met her confident tone. She went on, "Power is owning your space, hiring your neighbors, feeding your community, and drafting your own contracts. For far too long, we have been told to wait for someone else to grant us that. No longer." A ripple of agreement spread through the room. An elderly man in the second row, Mr. Cololton, who had operated a soul food diner since 1974, nodded slowly. That nod meant everything. "This fall, we are launching the Community Equity Fund," Grace declared. "It is more than just money. It is mentorship, credit building, legal assistance, every resource we have never had but always deserved." A young Latina woman in the back raised her hand, asking if the support was only for food businesses. Smiling, Grace answered, "We are starting with what we know, but the vision is wider. Barbershops, bookstores, art studios, anything that nourishes the soul or mind matters." The room burst into a wave of light and applause. Applause filled the air as Grace felt a sudden tightness in her throat. This was not the kind of wedding scene where she stood exposed to judgment and scrutiny. No, this was something unfamiliar, the ground shifting beneath her feet. Later, as chairs were stacked and coffee cups discarded, David approached her, his sleeves rolled up and sweat glistening at his temples. "Now, you did well," he said, tapping her arm gently. "Very well," she breathed out. "I keep expecting everything to fall apart." He chuckled softly. "That's how you know it's genuine. Fake things never make your stomach flutter like this." She gave a faint smile. "I should get back. Helen is training the new pastry chef tonight." They walked together toward the car, the setting sun casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Just before they reached Grace's old sedan, David stopped. "By the way," he said, "you had a visitor earlier today. Didn't leave a name, but he asked about you. Said he used to know you back when you wore an apron and carried trays." Grace raised an eyebrow. That did not sound like a customer. It seemed more personal. The following day, just after the lunchtime rush, she noticed him standing outside the restaurant's patio gate. In a tailored gray vest and sleeves rolled up, it was Noah Benton, the last person she expected to see. Grace stepped outside slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. "Noah," she said. He turned toward her. His face was thinner and slightly paler than she recalled, but his eyes, the same intense blue, were fixed on hers. "I wasn't sure if you would allow me to come. Talk to you." She crossed her arms, uncertain if she wanted to embrace him or push him away. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he replied, "to apologize." Her jaw clenched tightly. "Apologize for what?" "Noah, for leaving you alone, for staying silent while I was embarrassed in front of your family." He flinched. "Yes, for all of it." The quiet between them lingered. "I was a coward," he admitted in a low voice. "You carried yourself with more strength that day than I have in years." Grace took a breath. "And now?" "I left the Mitchells," he said. "Gave up the family name. I have been working with an educational nonprofit in Oakland, teaching coding to children in public schools." She blinked, not expecting that. "I kept recalling what you said about building instead of breaking. I didn't know how to fix things, but I had to start somewhere." She looked at him, truly looked. He was not the groom she remembered at the altar, torn between his fiancée and his father. He appeared weary but far from weak. "Now I want to help," he said. "Not for praise. Just because I believe in what you are doing, I believe in you." Grace hesitated. Her heart urged her forward, but her mind stayed careful. "How can you help?" "I have connections," he said. "Strong ones, foundations, funders. I can make introductions quietly and let the work speak for itself." She thought it over and finally nodded. You will work with Marcus, she said. You will arrive early, stay late, and never speak for us. He smiled, a mix of sadness and relief. Deal. The following weeks passed by as though seen through a fast-forward lens. The truck initiative began with 3 old vehicles, bought at an auction and creatively redesigned by local artists. The scholarship fund received its initial group of candidates, children whose parents had never imagined college was an option. A small bookstore reopened thanks to support from the Equity Fund, managed by a retired teacher who shed tears when Grace handed her the very first grant check. Emily barely managed to get any sleep one night. She sat alone on the rooftop of her apartment building, watching the city skyline blink in the distance. David appeared beside her, holding 2 mugs of mint tea. Are you all right, love? He asked. Emily accepted the mug and replied, I think so. It feels like something big is on its way. David nodded. A major change, no doubt, Emily agreed silently. They drank their tea together in quiet contemplation. Then Grace quietly asked, Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I had simply knelt down that day, said I was sorry, and moved forward? David turned, eyes burning with determination. Because the girl who would have knelt is not the woman responsible for all this now. Grace smiled subtly, genuine but reserved. The following day, a reporter from the New York Times called. They had heard about Uprise, the fund, and the revitalized food trucks. They wanted to write a feature about Grace, hoping for a cover story. She hesitated at first, but then said, Only if you include interviews with David, Carmen, Marcus, and the children who received scholarships. This isn't just about me. The journalist paused and then agreed. 2 weeks later, the headline read, The Maid Who Stood Up and Then Lifted Others. People nationwide read it. Some were moved to tears, some donated, and others nodded quietly, recognizing something deeply familiar. Something long overdue was finally expressed. And somewhere inside a quiet house in Savannah, a white mother, who once yelled in anger and shame at a black girl on her wedding day, read the article silently. She folded the paper and began to cry. The morning after the article was published, Grace Johnson entered the restaurant kitchen, greeted by the sound of clapping. Her whole team had gathered near the preparation tables, applauding as she appeared, her face flushed from the busy morning rush. Ruth stepped forward, arms crossed but eyes shining with pride, and said, So, Miss Coverstar, are you going to forget us now that you're famous? Grace chuckled, slightly embarrassed. The moment I forget you all, I'd better be struck by lightning. Beneath the laughter, however, Grace felt a heavier burden. The article had sparked more than just pride. Phone calls flooded in from donors, reporters, curious watchers, but also hateful letters and cruel remarks. There were whispers accusing her of playing the race card and turning a private family moment into a media event. Grace did not waver, having already endured the worst shame under white linen tablecloths and a cake costing $1,000. Words could no longer disturb her, but something did unsettle her that afternoon. David Mitchell summoned her to his office with an unusual edge in his voice, saying, You need to see this. She followed him where his laptop sat open on the desk. He tapped the screen, revealing a shaky, low-resolution video clearly filmed on a phone. At first, it showed an image showed a parking lot before the familiar voice of Whitney Kingsley, the former fiancé, shouted loudly. I don't care what that little woman is up to now, she yelled at someone off screen. This won't last. Her kind always oversteps and ends up turning on one another, just like they always do. Grace Johnson felt her stomach twist at the sound. Then another voice joined in, a man's voice. Whitney, this is being recorded. I don't care. Let them watch. I am not sorry for revealing the truth, she declared firmly. The clip ended abruptly, leaving Grace staring at the screen for a long moment. Where did this come from? She asked Marcus. He exhaled and replied, An anonymous tip from someone within their family. I think the story is already making waves on Twitter. For a brief instant, Grace felt old wounds reopen. Not because Whitney's words caught her off guard. They did not. But because it showed how deeply the toxicity still lingered, even after everything that had transpired. I do not want to get involved, Emily said quietly. I have no desire to battle her in the media. Let her suffer in her own bitterness. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Are you certain this could completely ruin her? Looking out the window where the late afternoon sun scattered golden light across the pavement, she shook her head. I am not here to ruin anyone. I am here to create something new. Yet karma required no invitation. By that weekend, Whitney's family was experiencing a full-blown crisis. Several of their already vulnerable business ventures began to collapse. Sponsors withdrew, and a leading bridal fashion label publicly distanced itself, citing a misalignment of values. The greatest setback came when her mother's interior design firm lost its primary investor after the footage aired on national television. Meanwhile, the restaurant's reservations doubled, not because Grace Johnson sought popularity, but because people, especially those who had felt ignored, desired to be part of something authentic, grounded in respect. One evening after closing, Grace sat on the back steps with Marcus. The air was filled with scents of rosemary and citrus from the herb garden, while the city buzzed softly around them. "She is falling apart," Marcus said. "Whitney's entire reputation is crumbling." Grace did not respond immediately. She had always prioritized appearance over reality. At last, she admitted, "This was bound to happen." He studied her expression and asked, "Do you feel justified?" She looked at him and replied, "No, I just feel drained." They remained quiet. Then he added, "Do you still believe we should avoid replying?" Grace thought about it and said, "I think we already have. In every dish we prepare, every employee we bring on board, and every child we help support." Marcus smiled faintly and said, "You never give up." "I am consistent," she corrected him. The next week, Emily Carter received an unexpected invitation and an all-expenses-paid trip to Washington, D.C. to speak at a congressional panel on racial fairness in the service sector. She almost refused because she disliked the spotlight, but Ruth insisted. "You don't go for yourself," Ruth said, standing with her arms pressed against her hips. "You go for those who will never get invited. The cleaners who still cry in hidden hallways, the dishwashers who no one acknowledges." No one saw it coming, so she headed to Capitol Hill feeling colder than she had anticipated. The environment was polished, imposing, yet when Grace Johnson stepped up to the microphone and faced the semicircle of senators and leaders before her, she did not tremble. Her voice remained calm and steady. "I am not here as a victim," she began. "I am here to bear witness." She shared the story of the day she faced humiliation, the pressure to kneel, the countless eyes watching her. Silence filled the room after her words, but she insisted, "That day does not define me. What shapes me is what I chose to do afterward." A senator then asked if she thought change was achievable. "I have faith in people," Grace responded. "Systems evolve slowly, but hard hearts can crack in an instant. I have witnessed that." Following her address, several aides came forward with cards, congratulations, and inquiries. An older senator with gray hair and weary eyes grasped her hand for a long moment. "My mother was a maid," he confessed. "She never found the courage to speak up. Thank you for doing what she could not." Her team celebrated her with a surprise dinner. Candlelit tables, homemade food, and laughter bounced off the walls. David Mitchell stood nearby at the bar, smiling quietly as she entered. Though they had not spoken much since his return, he was there, silently supportive. After dessert, Ruth raised a glass in honor of Grace for refusing to kneel and inspiring others to rise. The room erupted in applause. Grace, cheeks flushed, lifted her glass in return. "To all of us," she said, "for standing strong." Later that evening, after the staff had departed, Grace remained behind. Walking through the calm dining room, Emily Carter gently trailed her fingers along the edges of the tables until she paused at a particular booth. It was the one she always avoided, identical in design to the table from that wedding. The same curve, the same corner where she had sat. She settled down, closed her eyes, and for the first time allowed herself to cry, not from sorrow, but from a deeper feeling of release. The situation had changed, and now she was the one in control, the one creating the menu. The morning air held a peculiar quietness, a kind of calm. Grace Johnson hadn't felt since the very first day she stood beneath the ruined wedding arch, trembling yet determined. Now, after several months, the restaurant was flourishing, not only filled with customers, but with new meaning. Still, amid all the success, a quiet part of her held on to that moment. The moment when she did not bend down, but stood tall behind the front counter, scanning the reservation list. Today was full bouquet Saturday brunch, and the guest list included respected community members such as a local mayor, a retired school principal, and a pastor who had once marched alongside Dr. King. However, One name on the list caused her to hesitate. Elisa Kingsley. Emily stared at it, her mouth slightly open in disbelief, her fingers tightening on the paper more than she realized. Elisa Whitney's mother. David Mitchell appeared beside her and asked with concern if everything was all right. She hesitated before passing him the list. He saw the name immediately and asked, "Do you want me to cancel number?" She shook her head slowly and said to let her come. The news quickly spread among the staff, and when Helen Carter noticed, she raised an eyebrow in surprise. "I heard that woman spoke terrible things about you, darling. Are you really willing to serve her eggs Benedict and smile as if it is a peaceful Sunday morning?" Grace forced a tight grin. "She is coming here to my place, and that is already enough." Exactly at 10:30 a.m., the glass doors slid open and Eliza Mitchell stepped inside. Her posture was stiff, as if she was preparing herself mentally. Her eyes swept across the room with wariness, like she anticipated being stared at. Wearing a pale blue blouse and pearl earrings, she appeared eager to blend in, but her unease was unmistakable. Grace approached with calm confidence. "Welcome to the turning table. Do you have a reservation?" Eliza's eyes flickered slightly and she answered, "Yes, under Mitchell. Right this way." Grace led her to a window seat beside the flower bed, a quiet spot with just the right amount of seclusion. Eliza sat upright, hands folded neatly on her lap. When Grace set the menu before her, Eliza finally broke the silence with a strained voice. "I did not come here to cause trouble." Grace responded softly, "I assume that is so, but if you had, my team would be ready to escort you out." Eliza gave a nervous chuckle. "I would not blame you for it." Grace gave a subtle nod and said someone would be with her shortly, then turned to leave, but Eliza quickly reached out. "Wait, Grace, pause." Lowering her voice, Eliza said, "I read everything, the interviews, the articles. I even watched the video, too." Grace stayed silent. Eliza went on, "I did not realize it would turn out like that at the wedding. I did not expect Whitney to say those things." Grace slowly faced her again. "You did not stop her either." Eliza glanced down at her hands. "I didn't move. I just stood there and let it happen. Allowed my daughter to shame a woman who had done nothing wrong except hold herself with pride." Grace did not soften, not yet. Then, Eliza reached into her purse and took out a small envelope. Originally, it was meant to be a check, a donation, but I understood that money cannot solve every problem. So I decided to write a letter instead, saying, "If you're willing to read it." Grace accepted the envelope, but didn't open it. She placed it carefully inside her apron and gave a brief nod, saying, "Enjoy your lunch." Later that day, after the busy period ended, Mia entered the break room and opened the envelope. Inside were 2 pages of handwriting on cream-colored stationery. It started with, "Dear Grace, I raised a daughter who believes she was better than you because I allowed her to think so. I taught her to smile at the maid and thank the staff, but I never explained that being served doesn't make you superior, only responsible." Grace absorbed every word. When she finished reading, she folded the letter with care, held it to her chest, and exhaled a long, trembling breath. That evening, Marcus found her sitting beneath the olive tree in the garden with the letter next to her. "Want some company?" he asked. She nodded, and he sat down beside her on the bench. "Are you okay?" he inquired. She tilted her head back, watching the leaves dance in the breeze, and said, "I think I finally believe I am." Then she added, "Do you want to talk about it?" Her apology felt genuine, not the kind casually offered to soothe guilt, but one deeply felt in the core. Marcus leaned back and said, "Forgiveness is complicated. It does not erase memories, but it can create space." Grace looked at him curiously. "Space for what?" "Perhaps for peace. Maybe for healing." They sat quietly for several moments before David spoke. "Do you recall the day we first met?" She chuckled softly. "Absolutely, I was carrying a tray of champagne glasses, and you stepped right into my path and told me to move. I had no idea you were the groom." He smiled warmly. "You didn't even care. That's what caught my attention." She finally turned to him, asking a question she had been wanting to for weeks. "Why did you not go through with the wedding?" "You could have simply ignored it or smoothed things over." He met her gaze earnestly. "Because I didn't just hear her insult you. I heard her disrespect my father. If she could not accept where I came from, she could not truly love me." Grace lowered her eyes. "Grace, Your father, was he proud of your decision to walk away? David nodded slowly. He told me that day, son. The hardest part about being a black man in power is knowing when to let go of something that isn't worth fighting for. I never forgot those words. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves as the last light of evening cast a golden glow on their faces. You know, Grace said quietly, despite all the pain that day brought, I would never want to change it. David studied her face, seeking what lay beneath her words. She spoke again, her voice tender. It opened something within me, within you, within this entire place. And sometimes it is through brokenness that light is allowed to shine in. He smiled, deeply touched by her truth. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere hummed with the energy of the evening as Grace rose, brushing herself off. Hands away from her apron, I need to return inside. Marcus followed her closely. You realize what is incredible. You are not merely running a restaurant. Emily, you are creating an entirely new gathering spot. She stopped at the doorway, her heart full this time. She said, everyone is welcome. About 3 months had elapsed since Eliza Mitchell entered the turning table, leaving behind a note that sealed wounds Grace never thought could recover. But healing Grace had come to understand did not involve forgetting. It meant holding on to memories without hesitation. And today, that understanding was about to face another challenge. The autumn breeze carried aromas of cinnamon and roasted squash from the kitchen. Golden leaves twirled across the cobblestone entrance of the restaurant. Grace straightened the collar of her deep green manager's jacket and welcomed patrons with her familiar warmth, her smile sincere and unwavering. The restaurant was busier than ever, with bookings reserved weeks in advance. Yet this night, a different kind of energy buzzed beneath the festivity. Whitney was coming. Marcus had gently warned her the day before. She reached out saying she wished to talk with you. She did not request a table, only some time. Grace had nodded silently, feeling no fear, only intrigue and a peculiar, sorrowful calm at 6:05 p.m. as the amber lights cast their usual glow. The turning table. Whitney walked through the front doors, looking thinner than Grace remembered. Emily Carter remembered her face pale and tense beneath carefully applied makeup. The sparkling diamonds, the neat bun, and the designer heels were gone. Instead, she wore flats and a charcoal gray sweater over slacks. In her hands, she clutched a simple bouquet of sunflowers. Grace Johnson approached her with cautious steps. You came! Whitney's eyes were filled with doubt. I did not think you would agree to meet me. You did not come for a table, Grace said plainly, just words. Whitney swallowed deeply and presented the bouquet. These are for you. I know it is not much, but I did not want to arrive empty-handed. Grace took them without a word and placed them gently behind the host's stand. Let us talk in the garden. They moved through the side doors to the private garden area, usually reserved for quiet brunches and exclusive meetings. Tonight it was deserted, save for a small bistro table beneath the willow tree, the very spot where Grace once sat with Marcus, holding Eliza's letter close to her heart. They sat opposite each other in silence, while the willow branches fluttered and nearby wind chimes played soft, metallic tones. I did not recognize myself that day, Whitney finally spoke, her voice quivering. At the wedding? Yet somehow I did, and that terrified me. Grace listened quietly, not interrupting. I believed I had principles. I thought I could see people clearly. But the moment I felt threatened, whether emotionally or socially, I lashed out, revealing the ugliest side of myself. Grace's stare was unwavering. You did not just lash out, Whitney. You demanded that I kneel. Whitney's eyes welled with tears. I know I have. She had replayed it countless times, and when you didn't, when you stood there composed and confident, something inside me shattered. I hated it then, but now I believe it was envy. Grace leaned back a little and said, You were about to marry a man raised by a black father, a man who gave you his name, his life, and you viewed his pride as something to conquer. Whitney bowed her head and admitted, I realize I lost more than just a wedding that day. I lost him. I lost who I was. And tonight I came not to seek pardon because I know I am not worthy, but to thank you. That caught Grace by surprise. Thank me? For waking me up, for making me face myself? My mother never did that, nor did anyone in my world. But you stood firm when everyone was watching. You gave me a moment I couldn't escape from." Grace was silent for a moment, then gazed at the stars beginning to shine through the canopy. "Do you understand what it feels like?" Mia said softly. "To carry the silence of generations on your back? To be told again and again, sometimes subtly, sometimes openly, that you don't belong unless you submit?" Whitney nodded gently. "I'm starting to—" "No," Mia interrupted. "You are starting to listen, and that is what matters." Whitney looked upward, her eyes glistening, and asked, "What happens now?" Mia stood up from her seat and answered, "Now you keep listening. You use your voice to raise others, not to silence them. You make space for stories that are not your own, and you don't expect praise for simply doing what is right." Whitney rose, her voice barely audible. "I will." They stood together a little longer before Grace reached out her hand. Whitney hesitated before taking her hand. The contact was fleeting yet genuine. There was no forgiveness spoken, just a delicate new beginning. Later that evening, as Grace Johnson finished closing the registers and sent her team home with embraces and laughter, she stepped outside to secure the doors. David Mitchell was waiting near her car. "I saw her leave," he mentioned. "She had to." Grace responded, and he smiled. "You always had a way of getting people to reflect on themselves." She laughed softly. "I'm not sure that was ever my intention." They drove together to a community center downtown, where David had begun hosting monthly dinners and tables for those without family, warmth, or dignity. The turning table now catered for free. This night was special. The launch of the No Kneeling Needed mentorship initiative aimed at empowering young women of color working in hospitality. Grace stood at the front holding the microphone. The room was packed with young servers, busboys, line cooks, single mothers, and retired chefs, people familiar with quiet resilience. "When I was told to kneel," she started, "I stood still, not out of rebellion, but because my ancestors had knelt for centuries. I did not need to." The audience held their breath. "We teach young women how to plate food, pour wine, and fold napkins like orchids. But tonight we teach something different. How to stand with pride, strength, and grace." Applause spread. Some cried, others simply nodded, holding the moment like a silent prayer. As the night drew to a close, Grace noticed one girl no older than 17, serving an elderly woman with unsteady hands and a gentle smile. She caught Mia's glance, then straightened her posture and smiled broadly. Marcus approached her and said, "You created something that not only nourishes people, Mia, it also heals them." Grace looked around the room filled with laughter, with second chances, with voices that had once been silent now rising together. "No," she whispered, "we created it." Outside, the breeze was soft, the stars shone brighter than ever, and the table that had once been overturned by cruelty now stood strong. Not for power, not for gain, but for justice, for respect, and for every person who had been told to bow down when they were meant to stand tall. It was just after 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening when Grace received an email. The subject was simple: Request for Interview National Voices podcast. At first, she assumed it was spam, but the sender was genuine. National Voices was one of the biggest radio shows in the country, famous for featuring stories of social change, justice, and bravery. Grace stared at the email for nearly 10 minutes before calling Marcus. "You're being invited to speak on the same show that interviewed the First Lady last year," he said, his voice a combination of wonder and amusement. "I was washing dishes in the back of a wedding hall," she replied. "You changed the course of an empire," he said, "and you never needed an official title to do it." They decided she would accept the interview, but Grace insisted on one condition: she would not sit behind a studio microphone. If they wanted her story, they would come to the restaurant by the Turning Table 2. Several weeks later, the host of National Voices arrived, a middle-aged woman named Robin Clay. Her voice was calm and resonant, with a background in reporting on racial justice issues. She came with a small recording team. The setting was simple: no elaborate lighting, just 2 chairs placed in a private garden, a portable soundboard between them, and a picture of sweet tea resting nearby. The conversation began beneath the warm light of late afternoon. Tell us about the day that changed everything, Robin asked. Grace folded her hands calmly in her lap, her voice steady yet reflective. It was not just a single day. It was every day before that. Every moment she was told to move faster, speak softer, and kneel lower. But that wedding day ignited a fuse that had been smoldering for years. Did you know what would happen when you refused to kneel? Robin inquired. Grace responded, I did not think about it. I just knew I could not do it anymore. Not again. Not in front of all those people. Not even in front of myself. Robin leaned forward slightly and asked about the groom's response. Grace smiled softly, a touch of nostalgia in her eyes. Marcus did not hesitate, she said. That was the most shocking part. He did not wait for the crowd to react or consider his own public image. He heard what was said and chose to walk away from the life he had built with me. That kind of decisiveness is truly uncommon. Robin paused to let the words settle before softly adding, and now you run a restaurant that has become a symbol for something much larger. Grace glanced around the garden and through the windows thoughtfully, knowing how far the journey had brought her. The dining room hummed gently as guests chuckled and servers moved with effortless grace. No one barked orders or whispered behind anyone's back. We never intended this place to make a statement, yet I believe the world was waiting for such a space, a place where respect was an ingredient in every dish. Robin wore a sincere smile and moved with ease. You've launched a mentorship initiative, a scholarship fund, and you're gearing up to open in Detroit by next spring. What fuels your drive? Grace's tone softened. My mother had juggled 3 jobs without ever seeking gratitude. She taught me that the only thing necessary to claim your place in this world is breath. All else are rules set by others. Robin ended the interview after an hour and embraced Grace. I have spoken with senators and generals, but this could be one of the most compelling stories I have ever shared. When the segment aired that night, it spread rapidly within just a few hours. Grace's calm and quietly commanding voice traveled over radio waves into kitchens, cars, and late-night rest stops. Elderly women called, their voices trembling with tears. Retired chefs sent letters. A janitor from Kansas City confessed he had finally confronted his supervisor. Yet, it wasn't the attention that unsettled Grace. It was what happened the very next day. A man dressed in a charcoal jacket and gray knit cap appeared as she was locking the door for the afternoon. He seemed around 60, with weary eyes and rough hands. Are you Grace? He inquired. I am. You don't know me, but you already knew your mother. Grace's breath hitched. You knew Annalise William? I lived next door to her in Harlem. She would make peanut butter sandwiches for my children when we ran out of food. Her kindness stayed with me forever. I heard you on the radio last night and thought that must be Annalise's daughter. You definitely inherited her strength. Emily welcomed him inside, prepared some herbal tea, and they spoke until the sky turned a deep purple. When he departed, Grace stood by the window watching him walk away down the street, feeling a shift inside herself, not pride or achievement, but a sense of belonging. The legacy of her mother's quiet influence was connected to more people than she had ever realized. A fortnight later, David shared some news. We are starting a new project, he told the team as they gathered for their weekly dinner. It is named the Second Seat Project and involves teaming up with restaurants nationwide to ensure workers have a place at the table, not merely customers. It promotes opportunities for ownership guidance and creative leadership because it is time the people who prepare the meals participate in making the decisions. Grace lifted her glass in honor of every maid server, dishwasher, and busboy who had been told they were unwelcome. Your seat is here. The group burst into applause that evening. Inspired, she wrote in her journal, a ritual Helen had taught her in precise script. She wrote, Mom, I refuse to kneel, and now they stand beside me. Gently closing the book, she later received an unexpected ornate invitation. Adorned with golden edges, the letter came from the city council. Grace Johnson had been nominated for the Civic Honor Award, celebrating individuals who have sparked social change through leadership in their communities. She gazed at the letter, overwhelmed by the moment. Marcus found her on the porch, holding it tightly with both hands. You truly deserve this, he said quietly. I never sought any of it, she murmured. yet you earned every part of it. She nodded and then asked, "Will you come with me?" He smiled warmly. I wouldn't miss it. On the evening of the ceremony, Grace entered the auditorium not dressed in fancy heels or pearls, but in her uniform, the very one she wore on the day that shifted her entire life. She chose this outfit to remind herself of where she came from. As she stepped onto the stage, her eyes met those of a young black girl sitting in the second row, no older than 9, gripping her father's hand tightly, her eyes shining with wonder. Grace smiled softly and took the microphone. There was a time when I believed my job defined my value, but I have realized that who you serve matters far less than the way you carry yourself. I stood tall when I was told to kneel, and because of that, stand others are rising too. The applause surged like a powerful wave, and deep within Grace she felt something beyond pride or glory. She felt peace, for sometimes justice does not come with flashing sirens or court verdicts, but appears quietly at a dinner table where everyone, yes, everyone, deserves dignity and respect. On the morning when the Turning Table's second venue in Detroit prepared to reopen, the sky was filled with a gentle amber glow. No snow had fallen yet, but the atmosphere held a silent anticipation that hinted at something new unfolding. Grace stood before the mirror in her simple hotel room, adjusting the dark green server apron she had worn the day she refused to bow. It had become far more than a piece of clothing. It was now a symbol, a fabric infused with memories, struggle, and strength. Downstairs, the staff was alive with activity. David, stationed by the host's stand, glanced at his watch while giving last-minute directions to the new team members. The kitchen noises blended with the preparation of fried catfish, collard greens, cornbread glazed with honey, and peach cobbler. This was not merely a restaurant, but a sanctuary where heritage could thrive once more. Grace slowly made her way down the stairs. When David noticed her, his smile carried the weight of every hardship they had overcome together. "Are you ready?" he asked. She glanced around at the team, the gleaming tables, and the brass welcome sign etched with the words, "For those once told, not your place. This is your home." "More than ready," she replied. However, just as they turned to face the entrance, a gentle knock came from the door. A boy no older than 17 stood there, clutching a white envelope with nervous tension in his posture. Wearing a worn hoodie and holding a red bicycle helmet, he hesitated before asking, "Excuse me, are you Grace Johnson?" "Yes," she replied softly. "I was instructed to give you this." He handed her the envelope, nodded, and walked away before she could ask anything further. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Secret admirer?" She unfolded the letter inside and read aloud, "I watched the broadcast. My daughter did too. And for the first time, she saw someone who resembled her, leading with authority without raising their voice. You provided us with something we did not realize we were missing. Eleanor Carver." Grace exhaled deeply. Eleanor Carver, the same matriarch who had once tried to make her bow and disrupted her daughter's wedding. Grace had not thought about her in months, yet the note lacked bitterness or sarcasm. It felt honest and humble. Carefully, she slipped the letter into her apron pocket and said to Marcus, "Let's open the doors." By midday, the establishment was bustling, some attracted by the food, most drawn by the story. Grace moved from table to table, not as the host, but as an observer. An elderly woman with silvered braids grasped her hand and whispered, "I have not felt this way in 50 years. A father with 2 adolescent sons murmured, "They are watching you, Miss Johnson. They are learning." At around 2 o'clock, a recognizable figure stepped through the entrance. It was Robin Clay, the radio personality from National Voices. "I could not miss this," she said. "You have grown into more than just a voice on the airwaves. You are the echo in many hearts." Grace offered her a seat, but Robin declined. "I am not staying. I only wanted to give you this." She handed her a small, inside the smooth, dark wooden box, lay a plaque inscribed in honor of Grace Johnson, whose silence spoke louder than any noise, whose stillness was powerful enough to move mountains. For a moment, Emily Carter was speechless, only nodding with eyes shimmering as the evening approached. Marcus then gathered everyone in the courtyard, where fairy lights twinkled softly, casting a warm golden glow. Staff and guests stood together sharing bread, creating a sacred atmosphere that felt like a church or a home or even an ancient tradition revived. Marcus raised his glass and said, "Before the night ends, I want to share something. A few months ago, I walked away from a wedding that would have taken everything from me: money, reputation, alliances. Yet what I found afterward was worth tenfold: a hidden truth, a legacy I had to embrace." He looked at Grace and added, his voice trembling slightly, "You did not simply fight injustice. You changed the entire narrative. You reminded us that sometimes the strongest act is not in shouting, but in standing tall when everyone expects you to fall." A long pause followed. Then, one by one, people stood to place a flower on a long, empty wooden table by the wall. There were no name tags, no candles, just the bare surface. Emily glanced at Marcus, who quietly said, "It is for all those who never had a seat at the table." Emily felt her throat tighten as the first man put down a magnolia. A woman added daisies, a child contributed a paper flower, and finally, Emily joined in placing her flower. She placed the envelope from Eleanor Carver on the table and sealed it before opening another. It was the final one. Later, as they tidied up, Grace found herself alone in the kitchen. The sounds of celebration had faded, dishes were piled up, and the last pot had finished simmering. She wiped her hands, switched off the last light, and glanced around. Her mother would have cherished this place. "Mama," she murmured softly as if her presence was still close, "we made it." She then stepped outside where snow was gently falling, blanketing the ground in white. David was waiting at the curb, holding the car door open for her. "Where to now?" he asked with a smile. "Home," she replied. "Still in your uniform?" he joked, as always. As they drove off, the lights from the revolving table shone behind them like a guiding beacon. Although the world outside remained scarred by injustice and division, inside that single place, where a maid once stood proud and refused to bend, hope was firmly seated at every table, and it would never rise to leave.